We're back and joined by one of my favorite people. His name is Benjamin Weingarten. He has been contributing mightily through a number of platforms to what I think of as the public policy debate on the most important issues of our day, and we're going to talk with him about a couple of them. He is a senior contributor to a terrific online resource, The Federalist, as well as a fellow of the Claremont Institute, one of the great public policy think tanks in our country. And he's always a welcome guest here. Ben, thank you for joining us. Welcome back.
Frank, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So much to talk about, and just a little bit of time to do it. Let's start with Iran and the deal that's evidently just about done. Details of it are dribbling out. What do we know about what the US government under Joe Biden has been doing, and what is the upshot of this effort to get a new uh, nuclear agreement with the Iranian mullahs?
I think simply put, Iran Deal 2.0 will be Iran Deal 1.0 on steroids. It appears that one of the major stipulations of this agreement will be removing the terrorism designation from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the jihadist army of Iran. Additionally, of course, this will flood the coffers of the mullahs, the lifeblood of the regime, including with oil money. And apparently, we will probably be paying for some of that oil to salve the oil really shortages that we've had when we were an energy independent country just a president ago. And to add to it, we see this burgeoning uh, Chinese, Russian, Iranian axis, and of course their proxies and partners, including in our own hemisphere. This deal was negotiated via Russia. So at the same time, the Biden administration calls Vladimir Putin a war criminal and he's cast as a modern day Hitler. The administration is using Russia as the conduit to execute this deal. And there are carve outs with respect to Russia, it appears, with respect to these oil deals that will be baked into the agreement as well. So we're effectively going to be paying for the privilege of, at very minimum, defending Iran's nuclear program again, and of course, enabling the creation of a bomb which could be proliferated and handed off to partners and proxies of the Iranian regime as well. And all of this has really been under cover of darkness. How often do you hear Robert Malley's name mentioned in the media, the person who is running point on this, a person who's been apologist for Islamists, Sunni and Shia, and worse, quite frankly, for decades now? That is who the Biden administration has entrusted with continuing the Obama Biden agenda of trying to create a solution in the Middle East, which will involve nuclearization ultimately and trying to, again, make Iran the strong course in the region.
Ben, that description seems to me to be a formula for absolute disaster on so many different fronts. Robert Malley, it should be recalled, was the perpetrator in chief, I think, of the first of these very, very unsatisfactory agreements. Donald Trump called it rightly, I think, the worst deal in history. To the extent that we're going to see a bomb emerging from Iran in short order, probably, the Israelis have said that's not going to be tolerated. Our government says it's not going to be tolerated either, but obviously they have every intention of tolerating it, in fact, enabling it. But the Israelis may be a different story. You follow closely Israeli government decision making. Do you anticipate they will take matters into their own hands? And if so, how do you expect the Biden team is going to respond by, at the very least, perhaps tipping off the Iranians that something's coming, or worse, perhaps actually interfering with an Israeli strike?
Well, on that latter point, I don't want to speculate at the specifics of what a U.S. response might be, but I will say that I think the analyses of the likes of Lee Smith and Tony Badran about some of the inside baseball around trying to pressure Israel over the Russian Ukrainian situation, I think does bear on this. It's very clear that the Obama Biden administration was hostile towards Israel, in many ways sought to kneecap Israel by leaking out intelligence about what it might do in connection with Iran's weapons programs and other malign activities. So I'm concerned, let's put it that way, about what the Biden administration might do to intercede to the extent that our strongest ally in the region feels it needs to act because of an existential threat. Now, setting all of that aside for a moment, I also want to make a point that I don't think has been emphasized enough, which is if the Biden administration believes this deal is so overwhelmingly in the national interest of America, why hasn't it committed to submit it to the Senate as a treaty? That's where the American people would be represented in this deal. And I think one of the most disturbing trends we've seen over the last 5+ years, and really well beyond that, is the idea that the people have no say whatsoever over the national security and foreign policy over the United States. And that's led to disastrous consequences for the people who actually bear the burdens of those policies.
both with their tax dollars and often with their children or in their own right. Ben, this is a subject to which we will return with you, I hope, in the days very soon to come, because we are expecting this deal to be rolled out at any moment. And the answer to your question, as you know perfectly well, is this administration has no intention of sending this document forward to the Congress for, you know, I think, formal approval. Certainly not by a two-thirds majority of the United States Senate, as a treaty would entail, any more than Obama did the first version of it. Shame on them. And it ought to be something that is used as an argument for cutting off the funding associated with this enterprise, it seems to me. Let me turn to a different topic, Ben. We're, of course, this week hearing about the views of the woman that President Biden has nominated to become the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Katanya Brown Jackson. I wanted to ask you about some of the things that she has said that are frankly very troubling to me. One, she professes that she doesn't hasn't really studied critical race theory and seemed to be saying she was mostly ignorant about it. She has clearly indicated that she's got sympathies at the extreme end of the left's views of uh, the gender identity stuff by saying she can't define what a woman is. And then, not least, of course, have been the concerns that have been raised by, among others, several United States senators now, concerning her attitude and her rulings as a judge with respect to what I've always thought of as basically sexual predators, but we're now being told are just minor attracted persons. Does this sound like the kind of person that ought to be sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States?
This seems like the kind of person who wouldn't deserve to be elected dog catcher, let alone an academic in the kind of elite institutions that she comes from, including serving as the editor of Harvard Law Review. Look, soft on crime and soft on the most perverse of criminals, can't define what a woman is and defers, sort of tries to sidetrack it by saying I'm not a biologist. The most just a beyond absurd response. And of course, pleading the fifth in effect on critical race theory when she was a fan of Derek Bell, one of the leaders of CRT, and she's praised many of the CRT adjacent acolytes like Nicole Hannah Jones and beyond, and I believe serves on the board of a local school which promotes all manner of quote unquote anti racist literature. It all strains credulity, but I think it is worth saying this. This is someone that Democrats believe that the president of the United States and his party and the progressive groups that dominate it believe ought to be sitting on the highest court in the land and ought to represent their view of what American jurisprudence ought to be. This is a feature of the modern Democrat Party, not a bug. This is not someone who is radical relative to the Democratic Party. This is someone who is in the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And that is Rubicon crossing. Yes, we have had other radical Supreme Court justices from the left. But to this extent, I'm not sure they would have been so open with it. But I think it's unavoidable because the record is so voluminous in terms of her rulings, her rhetoric, and beyond. This is who the Democratic Party is.
Well, it's interesting you use the term open because I think one of the strikes here is that it seems as though she's being disingenuous in the course of this testimony. And I think, despite her best efforts to obscure her views, her track record, her um, predilections, shall we say. She's, been uh, exposed by a number of these senators in their cross examination of her. But the bigger question, which is really what I think you're getting at, is the judgment. And her judgment is that of an awful lot of people now on, well, what we used to think of as the radical left, but increasingly it's kind of the mainstream Democratic Party politics. And if this nomination were to translate into, a confirmation, heaven help us. The argument is, well, it's just a leftist replacing another leftist member of the court. She's no Stephen Bryan, that's for sure. But more to the point, I think, and we have to leave it at this, Ben Weingarten, I'm afraid, what she is espousing is the kind of thing that will radicalize the court, I'm afraid, because she will be championing it very, very aggressively, you can be sure. A mistake to be avoided. Next up, we're going to talk to Chuck DeVore, a very accomplished public policy practitioner as well as analyst about Ukraine and, not least, about the national security implications of the commander in chief playing for the other team. Stay tuned.